75 years ago today, that is June 25th, South Korea was invaded by North Korea, and this invasion led to a war that lasted 3 years. On Press Perspective today, we touch upon this past confrontation and our present challenges on the Korean peninsula. Hello, you're watching Press Perspective for this Wednesday, June 25th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we mark a solemn anniversary that is the start of the outbreak of the Korean War back in 1950. Now, that being said, in this session of our panel discussion with our foreign journalists, we shed light on the cross-border ties. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca with American news agency UPI here in the studio. Thomas, welcome.
Thanks, great to be here.
I also have Fabian Kretschmer with the German news agency DPA. Fabian, welcome.
Great to be in the studio here.
Right, Thomas, a journalist named Jack James, who worked for your agency, was the first foreign journalist to cover North Korea's incursion of South Korea in the wee hours of June 25th, 1950. Could you tell us a bit about this journalist?
Yes, so as you mentioned, he was the first one to break the story, even before Washington officials had confirmed it. So he was the manager of the Seoul, and then it was UP, United Press Bureau. And as the story goes, I guess he was planning to just go on a picnic that day and thought it was going to rain, went to the U.S. Embassy to pick up a raincoat. I guess he had left a raincoat there. And it was there that he met an Army intelligence officer who asked him about what he had heard about the border, and that's when he first got the information that something was going on across the border. And so he learned that North Korean Army units had crossed the 38th parallel, and then he apparently sent one of a Korean staff member up to the border to verify, and someone named George Su. Su came back, provided eyewitness reports, and then he filed it, and it came out on that Sunday. It was the only story to come out on the Sunday editions in Washington. And apparently, Washington phoned the Seoul embassy to confirm if the reports were true, which they were. I actually looked up the story. I mean, these are the first couple of lines. It says, troops from communist-dominated North Korea launched a series of attacks across the border into American-backed South Korea early Sunday, fragmentary reports from the frontier said. Mentioned that North Koreans were supported by tanks in the Chuncheon area. And that was it. Apparently the scoop also, he got a $50 raise for the scoop, and he became one of the better known journalists at that time. He was actually transferred, though, the next year to Hong Kong to cover China at that point. And then in 1954, he got out of journalism and joined the Asia Foundation, like a US-based think tank and public sector, sort of private public sector group, where he spent 27 years, died in 2000. And there's actually an exhibition about him at the National Museum of Korean Contemporary History here in Seoul going on right now.
Right. Fabian, keeping in mind the contributions of Jack James and, of course, sharing the story of the situation in South Korea back in 1950, beyond sharing just facts, what do you suppose is the broader job of a journalist covering a war zone?
I think that's really an interesting question, because there are many misunderstandings what the actual role of a war correspondent is, and the role has also changed over the years. I mean, when I hear what the UPI correspondent achieved, I mean, that's amazing. And at that time, pre-internet, pre-smartphone, of course, it was very amazing what, just by documenting the facts, what you can achieve, because the world basically knew about this war through the eyes of Jack James. And nowadays, I think we have more an information overload. So I think now, doses. So we basically need to know more about context. I think documenting the facts is not enough by itself. You have basically armies who have social media accounts. You have witnesses who post a lot of videos on their smartphones from every attack. So the role of the journalist is to collect all this information, give context, also analyze why conflicts are starting and happening and how they can be solved, and also fact-checking videos. So I think it's quite a different role. And the biggest command that actually has not changed over the years is to stay neutral. And that is actually a big task, because for some wars, for some conflicts, you have to be embedded with one side. For example, as part of the war in Iraq, many were embedded within the US military side. And then, yeah, of course, you only get to see what the US military wants you to see. And you always have to stay very transparent, have to stay neutral and try to keep some distance. And just one more example, Gaza. That's, for example, also a very difficult conflict to cover, because international journalists are not allowed inside Gaza, so they cannot even get access. So it's really a very challenging role, and the job as a war correspondent is not only dangerous, but also requires a lot of skills.
Right, it's a tough job, to say the least. Thomas, back here in South Korea, a recent survey by the Unification Ministry shows 4 out of 10 South Korean school students that is, believe unification with North Korea is not necessary. And apparently this ratio in itself has been rising steadily in recent years. How do you explain this phenomenon?
Right. Well, as you mentioned, so this poll came out from the Unification Ministry in April. It's an annual poll, and they polled 75,000 elementary, middle, and high school students. And so 42.3% said unification was not required, and that was up from 31.7% just 2 years before. Also just overall, more than 63% said they view North Korea as an adversary that warrants either caution or animosity, and negative perception was higher than positive perception by something like 30%. Mainly the main reasons that the students gave in their responses were concern about social problems, something like social integration of North Koreans, and economic burden. Those are the top two. And, that's a concern we've definitely heard and seen growing for quite a while among younger Koreans that are worried about their own economic futures, and then the idea of what it would take to integrate, North Korea into the country's. North Korea's GDP in 2023 was around 23 billion, while South Korea's was 1.73 trillion. There's this massive gap. And, I think socially too, just the idea, the longer the countries have been separated, it seems that the greater the gap has grown, obviously, in wealth, but just in kind of social, society and culture and awareness of the world. And I think the idea of integrating North Koreans into the South seems such a daunting or impossible task, and, such an expensive task as well. I mean, maybe not even that long ago. I think even during the Park Geun-hye administration, there was this idea of, North Korea could be this economic, benefit. We'd get all of these lower cost, workers entering the workforce, and that could be helpful and help the demographic crisis we're facing. But I think that idea is sort of passing by, and the idea that the skills gap would just be so large. And, the ministry also said in their analysis that, also just the public perception has been weakening because of North Korean provocations and inter-Korean relations being severed, and that's been going on over these past several years. When you think about younger kids now, they probably don't even remember the last period of détente, like in 2017 or 2018. And so, the hostility has grown so much over the past few years. So there's, this sense of just seeing North Korea as an enemy, and I think when you look at older generations, there was a more direct connection with, people literally were sisters and brothers, had been, were separated during the war. There was, like a real life memory of people that were North Koreans. Now that time has gone, just has passed so long that there's not the same sense of kinship or oneness. And I think also, there used to be this idea of, it still exists, of kind of a Korean ethnic, identity. It's called minjok, I guess, and I think that also among younger generations has really been sort of diminishing in the sense. So there's not really the same idea as strongly, I think, in previous generations as we're all one people because we're Korean somehow. So those are some of the reasons. At the same time, I also think there is a sense of this is kind of an abstraction. I do wonder sometimes if this were actually going to happen for some reason, either a hard landing or soft landing, where we had the sense that we needed to integrate. I do think maybe younger generation might be more open to it or more curious about it, and maybe that's something, Fabian, you might have a perspective from how Germany reacted. I mean, it was a different situation. So, I do think in some sense it just feels perhaps like a far off possibility, but that's where the attitudes stand these days.
Right then, Fabian, as Thomas has just mentioned, when South Koreans do talk about the prospects of unification here in the Korean Peninsula, they often refer to or mention the unification between East and West Germany. What does history tell us about the sentiments of the Germans just before their reunification?
Actually, when I looked it up, I was quite surprised by myself, because now almost no German would actually question or doubt that the unification at that time in 1990 was the correct decision. I mean, there's really consensus that unification was correct. It was a good thing. It was a historic chance. But at that time, basically, it was very controversially debated. The movement within East Germany, in the socialist state, the people who demonstrated and brought the regime down, they wanted to live in a more freer society, in a more economically prosperous society. They wanted to have more political participation. But whether they would be unified with West Germany, that was actually not the main agenda for them. Equally in West Germany, among all political spectrums, from the conservatives to the social democrats, the more leftist people, it was basically 50-50. Some said yes, unification would be good, would be beneficial. Others were worried about economic costs, or some said no, I think it's not a problem to coexist between and have two states. And yeah, I wasn't really aware about that. And maybe the lesson that can be drawn for Korea is that actually unification can be maybe, or whether it's good or bad, I mean, I think that is open for debate, but Germany was never as separated as long as Korea is now. The economic gap between the two countries in West and East Germany was also big, but definitely not as big as between South and North Korea. And the two countries were never really as isolated from each other as North and South Korea are today. I mean, you could always send some letters, you could have some exchange between also families in the West and East Germany. So yeah, basically it's a little bit a depressing lesson, because unification seems quite out of reach right now when you look at the situation in the Korean Peninsula.
Right. And as I mentioned in the clip, Thomas, today, Korea, the two Koreas that is, marks the start of the outbreak of the Korean War on the Korean Peninsula. President Lee Jae-myung shared a message on his social media platform today in light of the solemn anniversary. What did he say, Thomas?
Right, so I saw it on Facebook. I'm not sure if he shared it on other platforms, and it was quite brief. I mean, he really focused mostly on the idea of establishing peace on this anniversary of the war. You know, he wrote, and this is a translation, creating a country that will never experience war again is the right way to respond to the sacrifices and dedication of so many people. The most certain security is a state where there is no need to fight. You know, that is creating peace, sort of saying that the era of relying on military power is over. It's more important to win without fighting than win by fighting. So, you know, it echoes basically how he has framed what he wants the relationship with North Korea to be like under his administration. You know, he's talked often, I don't think he's over-promised, you know, sort of new détente, but he's definitely talked about creating the conditions for peace, bringing down sort of the temperature on the peninsula, and you know, so that was really the stance he took. He also paid respects to the fallen soldiers and veterans. He made a point about saying that South Korea's transformation into this global economic power that it is today wouldn't have been possible without their sacrifices. You know, he mentioned wanting to do more to help the veterans and their families, you know, support them. So that was, you know, generally it. He just said, you know, he pledged to firmly establish a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, which is a phrase we've heard in the past. It felt like you know, not so much the previous administration, but maybe under the Moon Jae-in and the more sunshine-oriented administrations have used this kind of language, you know, a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. So that's yeah, how he sent the message. It was not very long.
Right, and President Lee Jae-myung has also nominated Chung Dong-young to the post of unification minister. What can you tell us about Chung Dong-yong and his potential approach to North Korea?
Well, I can tell you that he used to be a former colleague of ours. He started his career as a journalist, and he was pretty much a well-known news anchor also. He worked for one of the three big public broadcasters here in South Korea, nationwide broadcasters. And sorry, actually not public, private broadcaster. But yeah, he then in the mid-90s, 1990s, switched over to become a politician. At that time, he was still very young, and he already was unification minister pretty much 20 years ago under Roh Moo-hyun, under also a liberal president. And during that time, he had one big achievement. He was really a crucial figure in establishing the Kaesong industrial zone. And I need to explain that just at the border between South and North Korea, on the North Korean side, there was an industrial zone, an economic zone where South Korean factory owners, they established factories, and North Korean workers produced textile and other goods. And if you look at it now, it's kind of an amazing project, but it came to operation came to a halt when the political relation between the two countries became sour. But yeah, he was basically crucial in establishing that project, and he basically received or made sure that the US gave support to that project. So I would say you can say he's, in terms of North Korea, one of the most veteran experts that the ruling party nowadays has. So I think it's quite a well-qualified figure, but right now the situation has changed. North Korea has changed. North Korea has dropped also the unification goal officially in their policy. So how should South Korea react? I think that's actually a tough question. And so I would say right now the focus is on establishing peace and not so much unification. So yeah, it is really a tough job that Mr. Jong is facing.
Right. Thomas, as Fabian just mentioned, North Korea's Kim Jong-un ruled out prospects of unification with South Korea during the former South Korean administration. But do you envision perhaps a shift in the sense of animosity on the Korean peninsula now that we have a new South Korean administration in power?
Well, I think right now it's hard to see really any strong indications. You know, you can look for these little things, maybe these little temperature going down moments. You know, Lee Jae-myung ordered the suspension of the propaganda loudspeakers at the DMZ, and apparently North Korea responded by turning down their speakers that were blasting noise and weird sounds. You know, there are little things like that. I think a lot of it is just trying to interpret, are they saying, is North Korea saying more, saying less? You know, what is their tone like? But it's still so early. We haven't seen much response. You know, so, and it's hard. It's quite hard to imagine things going to a warm relationship. But I would also say, you know, in history, the pendulum has swung back and forth so many times that you also, you know, I would never say never. You know, there could be a sort of a bigger reversal. But, you know, when you compare now to the time of the last big détente period, this 2017, 2018, I mean, a lot has changed since then. And, you know, you can see it being a little bit harder perhaps to reestablish something, just because, you know, North Korea is so much farther along on its nuclear and its weapons programs. You know, you know, North Korea, if it did just say come back to a negotiating table, would be coming back from a much different position, a position of much more leverage. You know, there's also not the sense that maybe North Korea needs something quite as much, at least now with this relationship with Russia. They're getting, you know, some financial support, getting other, you know, and they're at least not as entirely isolated from the world as they have been at certain points, and as vulnerable to sanctions. But, you know, those situations could obviously change. I mean, it's not clear that that's a lasting relationship forever. You know, and obviously Lee Jae-myung has set out this goal to kind of lower the level of hostility, so that, you know, you could see at least less aggression and less back and forth than we have been used to. But, you know, it still is hard to picture a reversal of some sort from the position that Kim Jong-un staked out. And there's also this Trump factor, you know, this idea that, you know, Donald Trump may want to swoop back in and restart his negotiations with Kim Jong-un, and that could be something that could push the process along. You know, at the same time, I mean, that could happen, and I'm sure Lee Jae-myung would be supportive of that to some extent. But, you know, at the same time, looking at just say what happened with Iran, you know, there's a lot of, I think North Korea probably now is thinking, you know, this is more reason for us to keep our nuclear arsenal, and you know, not sure whether they would trust Trump to live up to any deals that were made. So that's, yeah, I think that's where things stand.
Right. Keeping in mind what Thomas has said, Fabian, do you suppose that civic engagement here in South Korea can perhaps serve to ease tensions on the Korean peninsula?
Well, ideally, there would be civic engagement between the two Koreas, but of course that's impossible because North Korea is preventing that. And yeah, I think that is important, that you need to engage citizens, that you also need to have an open debate, actually free from ideology, whether how a future North Korea policy could look like, whether unification should be a goal or not. I have the feeling that no matter, or depending on which political camp you belong to, you emphasize the threat by North Korea, others have a more rosy view. But I would wish that for North Korea, and especially in the question of unification, yes or no, you need to have realistic debates. For example, what could be possible steps? Could a model of federation work, and is it a decade-long process, or could unification happen overnight? What would you do with the North Korean elites? How would you try to integrate them into South Korea? I mean, those are all very difficult questions. And then the economic cost question. I mean, there are many reasons for you know, having economic benefits when Korea becomes a bigger country, but on the other hand, at least for a long period of time, North Korea, or integrating North Korea, would be a economic burden. So those questions need to be discussed, and I think, yeah, this debate is not really happening right now, but I think in the future it would really make sense if we have more questions debated like this.
Right. As a pundit I know once said, there are so many questions and so few answers.
Right.
All right, Fabian, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Thomas, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends Press Perspective for today. Thank you, as always, for watching.